Hi, thanks for checking out another edition of our monthly program called Space Alert. The global network was created in 1992 to stop the arms race from moving into space. Our guest this time is Professor Kevin Clements from New Zealand. We're very happy to have him, and we're going to be discussing the facility called Rocket Lab in New Zealand. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bruce. Lovely to be with you.
Glad to have you with us. Why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself, just so the listeners will know a bit more about you.
Okay. Actually, I'm getting a little bit of echo here. I'm not sure if that's all right, but from the recording perspective. I'm Kevin Clements, and I was the foundation director of the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago. I retired from that a year ago, and I continue to direct the Toda Peace Institute, which is based in Japan, but which I can direct from New Zealand, which is focusing on arms control disarmament and cooperative security, climate change and conflict, social media and violence, and building stable peace in Northeast Asia. I've been a peace researcher for the last, about another 35 years, and used to head up the Institute for Conflict Analysis at George Mason University in the past. But I've also been an anti-nuclear activist and was very deeply involved in New Zealand's campaign to make ourselves nuclear-free way back in the 1970s and 80s.
All right. Well, Kevin, on June 21st, just this past week, there was a protest at Rocket Lab, and the purpose of it apparently was to call for a Space for Peace campaign in your country. Can you first of all talk about what Rocket Lab is, and then talk about the protest that happened, and and I believe you were there, weren't you?
No, I wasn't there. I'm in Dunedin. That was in Auckland. Rocket Lab was developed, I think it was about 10 years ago, by a very entrepreneurial guy called Peter Beck, who was obsessed with the whole notion of rocketry and thought that you could only judge a nation's modernity by whether or not it had rocket-making capacity. So he managed to develop a kind of a consortium of active industries and so forth in the US that were interested in Rocket Lab's a unique global position in order to put in place multiple satellites and so forth from New Zealand. It's been successful as far as it goes, and next month, it's going public on the NASDAQ stock exchange, and it's expected to have a 4.5 billion float. It's now largely almost 100% owned by American corporations. So it's gone a long way from being a New Zealand initiative to now being potentially a New Zealand multinational. But its primary connection is with the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, and its associated departments. They're the ones who've been paying for most of the payloads.
So what was the purpose of the protest last week?
The purpose was to draw public attention. A lot of what they've been doing has been going under the radar of public opinion. It was sold to the local Maori community as a rocket lab that was primarily going to launch research and technological payloads that would benefit everybody because of in terms of maritime surveillance, research on space, looking at global pollution and all that kind of stuff. What we've discovered, however, if you look at all of the payloads that have gone up, is that almost all of them, I think it's about 70 or 80% of them, have been primarily US military payloads. And the payload that really got everybody very upset was one called Gunsmoke J, and that was a payload that was really aimed at enhancing um, the surveillance capacity of um, uh, the US military. So that was the one that got people very upset, because that was the one that was unequivocally a military satellite payload aimed at improving targeting and surveillance systems for US command and control uh, capacities. And a lot of us felt that it really infringed, if not the letter, then the spirit of our anti-nuclear legislation. It was placing us much higher in the US kill chain, and Rocket Lab had overstepped the mark completely. They couldn't argue that this was just technology for peaceful purposes, or essentially it was a research payload.
A moment ago, you mentioned the Maori, but I don't think a lot of listeners will know exactly who you're referring to. Can you talk a bit about the Maori and the location of this Rocket Lab facility and the link between the Rocket Lab and the Maori and their concerns as well?
Yes. Where Peter Beck did his homework and found that the most useful spot geographically and geospatially was on the Mahia Peninsula, which is sort of near the city of Gisborne, but it's largely on Maori land. So the local iwi, or the local Maori tribe, had to be persuaded that this was going to be in their interests. Peter Beck sold it to them on the basis of encouraging local employment and so forth, which it hasn't done by and large. Most people are scientists and engineers who are located in Auckland. And once they became aware of the payloads that were going up, they felt that they had been completely misled. The Maori population, the Maori people are the indigenous people of New Zealand. They constitute something like 14% of the total population. The New Zealand government has, over the past 30 years, been very actively involved through the Treaty of Waitangi process in trying to make sure reparations for colonial exploitation and expropriation of land. And so Maori iwi now have many resources at their disposal, as the government has made a lot of Treaty of Waitangi settlements as reparation for colonial annexation in the 19th century.
So, this whole thing reminds me of the story about Kodiak Island in Alaska. I don't know if you've heard about it.
No.
Kodiak Island is famous for salmon fishing and bears. It's a very pristine area. And a rocket company, a private company like Rocket Lab, came and said they wanted to build a launch facility there. And they said it would only be for civilian purposes. The community was not very welcoming. They didn't really want it. They tried to organize to stop it, but the state of Alaska really pushed it through. And since that time, virtually every single launch that's ever happened from Kodiak Island has been, guess what, military. There have been several accidents as well. In fact, Will Griffin, who's our board member of the Global Network and is doing tech work for us today, made a really good video about this particular situation. It's on our website, spaceforpeace.org, in our video section. I urge people to watch it because it really seems like it's the same story all over again. And this story is being repeated all over the world at various places where they need more launch facilities. And one of the reasons why is because of all the launches that they're anticipating in the coming years for both military and for civilian purposes. But let me ask you this. Does the launching of space missions with mostly military payloads, does that in any way violate New Zealand's non-nuclear declaration?
Well, that's what we've been looking at quite systematically. we've been challenging the government to ask us whether it does or not. I mean, the question is whether or not a payload that's aimed at supposedly conventional targeting of military forces can be switched through some software changes to become nuclear. If it can become nuclear, then it's indefinite infringement of our anti-nuclear legislation. It's the question of dual capability that is challenging people at the moment. We've been trying to kind of get some clarity there. First of all, around what research capacity do we really have in terms of our current authorization procedures for determining whether or not a payload is completely civilian, dual capable, or completely military. And our feeling is that the people that are doing the advisory work on this for our Ministry of Business, I mean, it shows you something about where this has come from. For our Ministry of Business, have been primarily, it's a very small technical unit attached, and by and large, they have never refused a payload request. So we're not concerned about whether or not this is going to be an infringement of our anti-nuclear legislation. And if it is, I mean, then of course the whole the lab would have to close down. We're worried about its impact on our anti-nuclear legislation. We're also worried about its impact on New Zealand's security, sovereignty, and national interests, because we now believe that we're definitely in some kind of U.S. Surveillance, if not kill chain, and in order of battle, and so we feel that we've now just added to our, to us becoming a very attractive target.
Yes, definitely, you would become a target. There's no doubt about that. There, we've learned over the years that I seem to be breaking up. Can you hear me at all?
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Over the years, we've learned that this is one of the tricks that the military uses by saying these missions are dual use, meaning that one part of them are civilian and one part of them are military. They sort of hide the devious purposes of them by calling them the dual use. But when these satellites are used for helping to surveil and then do targeting, then clearly they would be used by many different weapon systems, including the nuclear programs of the United States and its allies. So it would seem to me that there would be a real contradiction there when it comes to the honoring the non-nuclear declaration of New Zealand. As you all have, I know Lori Ross and others have tried to meet with Mr. Beck at Rocket Lab, and they've tried to appeal to the corporation to kind of stand down from this military role. What kind of response have you all received from Rocket Lab in that regard?
Well, Rocket Lab has basically pulled down the blinds on the opposition to it. When it got wind of the fact that this protest was being planned, Peter Beck went on a little charm offensive to basically try and reassure New Zealand citizens that the next launch they were going to engage in was actually going to be launching a satellite made out of plywood. He sort of made it all sound extremely cuddly, as though this was a part of a wider exploration to see how satellites could be put into space that would eventually disintegrate after they're used by date and so forth. And he was very, very keen to highlight the fact that, again, his own intentions and the intentions of all of the people who were working with Rocket Lab were absolutely peaceful, and they were simply aiding the research and development of satellite systems and so forth. So, I think that this is, this is one of the reasons why New Zealanders feel comfortable about it, because they have a very, very well-oiled PR machine. that comes into play wherever anybody raises a question about it. So they, on the one hand, refuse to meet. Secondly, they embarked on this major charm offensive. And thirdly, I mean, unfortunately, another Maori iwi in Christchurch, Naitahu, has been in negotiations with another rocket company about having another rocket capacity in the South Island of New Zealand. So there seems to be a complete obsession at the moment with rocketry. It's sort of like, reminiscent of Helen Caldicott's missile envy stuff.
Yeah. How has the mainstream media covered this story?
Not too badly. There was a major article written by a journalist in North and South, and that was a very fair coverage of what was happening. And the daily newspapers have given it some coverage, but the problem with the media coverage of it is that it seems like a kind of a very, very complex issue. So we have a outer space piece of Outer Space High Altitude Activities Act, which has a variety of assessment criteria for determining what happens. And whenever there's a protest against the rocket lab, the Minister of Economic Development and the Foreign Minister and the Minister of Arms Control and Disarmament say, well, as far as they know, it's all in compliance with the Act, which has some provisions for making sure that the launches are responsible, sustainable, safe, and aligned with New Zealand values and national interests. This act is going to be reviewed this year, so all of us that are opposed to Rocket Lab and any other rocket company are going to try and argue that this Outer Space High Altitude Activities Act assessment criteria needs to be very, very gravely tightened. And the responsibility for making these approvals needs to be vested in the hands of our Minister for Arms Control and Disarmament and our Public Advisory Committee on Arms Control and Disarmament. So as you can see from my brief comments there, it's all a little bit arcane for the average person. On the one hand, they feel that it's a wonderful example of New Zealand being up with the latest in terms of technology. On the other hand, they feel that it's under control because the government has this act to approve payloads. And whenever they see the protest movement coming up, they're sort of seen as killjoys trying to drag New Zealand back into the 20th century.
I understand at the protest on June 21st at Rocket Lab, there was a Maori Green Party member, is that correct? That he has sponsored some kind of legislation. Can you talk about that?
Yes, he sponsored legislation which basically is arguing for what I was just talking about, tighter control of the approval procedures. And if that tighter control doesn't come into play, I mean, he's very much in favor of closing it down.
So that's something I'm sure you all are getting behind then, huh?
Yes, and he has also been in very, very close contact with the Maori community in Mahia. And we're very privileged to have a long-time peace activist and Maori elder called Pauline Tangiora, who lives in the area. And she also joined the June 21st demonstration to say that basically she and her iwi were misled by Rocket Lab and that they no longer wish to be associated with it or give it their approval.
So there is some growth then in the movement around this, it appears.
Yes, I suspect that what's going to happen, certainly in the lead up to the NASDAQ public launch, is that they will try and make sure that the payloads are paid for by reputable university institutions or academic research programs and so forth, so that they can't be accused of launching another Gunsmoke J type of technology, which incidentally was manufactured by Sandia Laboratories, which I also thought was pretty close to infringing on national anti-nuclear legislation anyway. But so the local iwi now feels that they were sold a can of worms. They wish to withdraw from their agreement of the site, and I think that in itself will generate some opposition. But my sense is that if we can keep on highlighting payload by payload what's contained there, I think that will actually really help us a lot. I mean, in terms of building up national momentum. And if you look at Payload's board of directors, I'm just picking it up here, most of them American with extraordinarily strong links to the Pentagon. So no matter what you may think about the payloads, this is definitely part of America's military-industrial complex. Peter Beck is a key, but he's got very strong links to the Pentagon. Mike Griffin is a director who is an American former undersecretary of the Department of Defense and head of their Missile Defense Agency and the Defense Innovation Unit. So he's on the board, I mean, as a director.
Yeah.
Sven Stroban is an American financer. David Cohen is an American expert on cybersecurity. Matt Ocko is an American specialist on cybersecurity and national defense. So there's only one New Zealander out of 5. So as far as I'm concerned, the board of directors are already kind of clearly Pentagon surrogate officials.
Well, I have a picture. Someone took a picture of inside of Rocket Lab, and on the wall are 2 flags. One is an American flag, and the other is a New Zealand flag.
That's right.
And we know that Lockheed Martin is heavily involved in this program. So It's very clear to me that, at least it appears to me, that the Pentagon and that list of names you just read, and Griffin, I'm very familiar with Griffin. As you said, he ran the Missile Defense Agency. So he's and he worked with Ronald Reagan on the original Star Wars program.
Exactly.
So, this whole thing reeks of Star Wars. It reeks of Lockheed Martin, Pentagon, and total deviousness. I mean, really.
Well, and more than that, Peter Beck now is trying to sort of position himself as in competition with Elon Musk and what is called the X-Rocket Lab, whatever it is that Musk runs. And so he's now in strong alliance with NASA around their Mars exploration, Venus explorations, and moon missions. So there's a very inextricable involvement there with NASA. And one of his fervent hopes is that in addition to putting up payloads, Rocket Lab will soon be able to launch a person into space as well. But also, if you go through the executive leadership, I mean, you may know some of these people. I mean, Eason Mosley is the American Space Systems Chief Engineer, ex-TIVAC. Sean DeMello, member of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Lars Hoffman is a senior vice president who used to work for SpaceX, National Security Space Strategy, is ex-US Air Force and ex-Pentagon. So you can't say that this is a New Zealand venture, sort of dedicated to kind of motherhood and apple pie, and simply interested in the exploration of space. I mean, these are people that are deeply embroiled in U.S. militarization of space, the reactivation of Star Wars, the kind of crazy Star Wars idea in the 21st century, and linked. I'm sure they're linked very strongly to the new U.S. Space Force and so forth. I mean, we just don't know what's going on in the background. But that's certainly linked very closely to all the U.S. surveillance mechanisms as part of it. We're part of the Five Eyes, which makes it complicated as well.
In 1997, the U.S. Space Command published a document called Vision for 2020. And in that military document, they talked about how the United States would control space, dominate space, and deny other countries access to space. And in fact, at their headquarters building in Colorado, above the doorway, they have a logo that reads Master of Space. So this is a very clear doctrine, military doctrine, that the United States, 5% of the world's population, intends to control and dominate space. And they say the only way this can be done is if they have all the eyes in the sky, they can hear everything, they can see everything, and they can target every place on the earth. Well, that takes lots of satellites. It takes lots of ground stations around the globe that relay the signals from the satellites. And that whole structure is now being put in place. But it's so expensive that the United States can't pay for it by itself. And that's one of the reasons they're going around the world and involving other countries in this program, getting aerospace corporations established in these various countries so that they then can extract money from the local government to help pay for this whole infrastructure, but with the US in charge of the tip of the spear. That's what it's really all about.
This is very frightening. And it's a confirmation of what we're worried about, which is that, New Zealanders think, well, this is, just payloads go up every month or however frequently it is, and that this is, just aiding, pure scientific research. But those of us that are beginning to look into this more closely can see exactly what you've been talking about. We've been designated that when you get a New Zealand entrepreneur going to see the Pentagon, they would jump at the idea of being able to launch medium to high altitude space rockets from New Zealand, because we'll get into different trajectories and so forth. And this is exactly what is concerning all of us, that we're becoming an integral part of the US desire to dominate space.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, Kevin. Is climate change a problem in New Zealand?
Well, it's a problem in the sense that the New Zealand government has now had a whole Royal Commission report on it, and is working very hard to make sure that we meet our carbon targets and everything else. And we're working towards becoming, a major contributor to positive climate change action. So the government is firmly committed to that.
It's a rhetorical question, because my follow-up question is really the clincher. Every time a rocket is launched, the toxic exhaust from that rocket is punching a larger hole in the Earth's ozone layer. And so when you look at the schedule today of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and a whole host of these corporations, including Rocket Lab, you're talking tens of thousands of rocket launches in the coming years. Imagine the cumulative impact on the ozone and the resulting climate change. So as we do this work, it's one thing I think that we've got to really also connect the dots to, is the impact on the ozone and climate change. Let me just, we're almost out of time.
Can I just respond to that by saying that in addition to that, I mean, if you look at the US military as a whole, with its 880 bases around the world, it is the biggest single entity emitting negative gases into the atmosphere. So when you couple that to what you just said about the impact of rocket launches, I mean, it's clear that the US military is one of the major, if not the major polluter in the world today.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. We've got less than a minute left. I want to ask you one last question. What can we in the global network and our friends and affiliate groups around the world do to help you all in New Zealand? We've got about 30 seconds.
I think what you're doing right here is exactly what we need. We need to make sure that this national political issue is globalized. We need the support of allies in the United States and others to give us the information we need to provide the government with alternative perspectives on the nature of the payloads. We need the best minds that we can gather who know all about rocketry and so forth to help us do the work so that we can kind of mount effective opposition to payloads and to Rocket Lab as an entity.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for coming on the show. You did a great job. We really appreciate it. We'll hopefully all of us will distribute this video out to others. And thank you for watching another edition of Space Alert. We'll do another show next month about peace in space with some other leaders from the movement around the world. Until then, good luck to you all, and please get organized.
Thank you. I heartily agree.